For 40 days on God, Family, and Guns, we'll be focused on God. We have a series on spiritual warfare, the end of times, the prophecy of Daniel, and the prophecy of Malachi. If you want to see our gun-related or Second Amendment-related content, you can see that on Patreon or the History of Weapons. Those links are below. Welcome to a series that we call The End of Times, where we're going through the book of Revelation verse by verse to try our best to see what it is we can expect to happen during the end times, but more importantly, what it is we should be doing in the end times. And as we've gone through the book of Revelation, I want to take this time to kind of remind you that of two things. Number one, you can't just jump in on Revelation and be an expert. A lot of people will grab a verse and suddenly they think they know what they're talking about. It's very important, if you want to know what it is you should be doing in the end times, that you take the time to study it verse by verse. God laid it out perfect, and we're going to leave it that way. So if you haven't gone back and watched the other episodes, this is episode 91. If you haven't gone back and watched the other episodes, please take the time to do that or study it out for yourself verse by verse. The other thing I want to remind you of is there's many things in Revelation that we see happen multiple times. We'll see it from different views. Now keep in mind, John is in the throne room of God, so much of what he's seeing, he is seeing in the throne room. But there's times he can then also look down on earth just like God can, and he can see what's taking place on earth as well. So we see things happen multiple times, so it's real important. You can't just read it like a story. You got to understand that oftentimes the things we look at, we've seen before. And this episode is going to be another example of that. So where we are is chapter 14, and the last episode we talked about there's three angels that are making some proclamations. Very significant because we're entering into the timeline-wise the end of tribulation and the beginning of a short period of time after tribulation and before Christ returns of about 45 days. And I'll get into that here in a second because we saw that in Daniel as well. But where we are is we saw a proclamation of one angel pronouncing the justice from God over the lawlessness on the earth. And it's a very significant piece. But there's this second angel making a proclamation, and we're going to pick it up in Revelation 14 starting in verse 8. And another angel followed, saying, Babylon is fallen, the great city, because she has made all nations drink of the wine of the wrath of her fornication. Now, this is one of the first mentions of Babylon, and Babylon is the spirit of Babylon. And when we get into chapter 17 and 18, we're going to get into great detail of what Babylon is and where Babylon is. But I think if everybody takes a moment and really prays about it, we all know where Babylon is. It's real obvious, especially when you read the details of what Babylon is in chapters 17 and 18. When we get there, we'll discuss that further. But what we're seeing is we're seeing the destruction of Babylon. Now, we've seen this before. If you go back to chapters 8, where we saw the trumpets and destroyed a third of the earth. And we've seen the destruction of Babylon. It's just now it's named for the first time. And essentially they're saying it is destroyed because she has made all nations drink of the wine of the wrath of her fornication. Now, as you know, I don't like to jump ahead here on this study, but we do need to jump ahead on this one just for a second because we're going to see this angel make that same proclamation in chapter 18. So again, I'm not jumping ahead often, but this is the time occasionally we do need to jump ahead. So I'm just going to pick it up in chapter 18, starting verse 1. After these things, I saw another angel coming down from heaven, having great authority, and the earth was illuminated with his glory. And he cried mightily with a loud voice, saying, Babylon the Great is fallen, has become a habitation of demons, a prison for every foul spirit, and a cage for every unclean and hated bird. For all the nations have drunk of the wine of the wrath of her fornication. The kings of the earth have committed fornication with her, and the merchants of the earth have become rich through the abundance of her luxury. And I heard another voice from heaven saying, Come out of her, my people, lest you share of her sins, lest you receive of her plagues. For her sins have reached to heaven, and God has remembered her iniquities. So this is kind of a big deal, what we're seeing here. There's a nation that exists, and again, I'm sure we all know where, that is so incredibly sinful that her sins have literally reached to heaven. It's crazy, the amount of sin that is taking place in Babylon, and as a result, justice is being unleashed on the earth. Now, again, we saw this take place in Revelation 8 during the 7 trumpets, but I want to speak to kind of this timeline for a moment on the destruction of Babylon. Because next episode, we're going to talk about the wine of God's wrath, and that's a huge understanding the wine of God's wrath. He's going to make them drink it, and he's going to make them slam it. He's going to get them drunk and staggering on the wine of his wrath. And it's really interesting kind of what that is. So we'll take the next episode and talk about that. But I kind of want to talk about the timeline of the destruction of Babylon, because we're going to see this in Daniel. And, a lot of people talk about this 3.5 years of tribulation. Yes, there's 3.5 years of tribulation. And we see that from the moment, well, let's just jump to Daniel, and we'll kind of talk about that, because Daniel saw this. In Daniel 12, we're going to pick it up in verse 11. And from the time that the daily sacrifice is taken away and the abomination of desolation is set up, there shall be 1,290 days. Now, what they're talking about here in Daniel, and this is Daniel 12, verse 11, what they're talking about is the Antichrist will declare himself to be God, and that is the desolation, the abomination of desolation. From that moment on, the warring of the saints begins, and it's 3.5 years. But there's a point where 3.5 years has ended, and we'll pick it up in 12. Blessed is he who waits and comes to 1,335 days. So ultimately what you got here is you have 3.5 years exactly of tribulation, and then it ends, and that's the destruction of Babylon. That destroys the Antichrist. The bowls of judgment are being poured out on the earth. The trumpets are being blasted, and that goes on for 45 days. That's when darkness comes on the earth. That's when all those, the bottomless pit is opened up. There's a lot that takes place. So ultimately what we're looking at is we're looking at 3.5 years of the warring of the saints between the Antichrist and the saints, where fathers are turning on sons, sons are turning on fathers. Essentially, we will be outlaws. And there will be a war that will go on, and a persecution, a tribulation for 3.5 years. But then that'll end because God steps in, and that's what we're seeing take place here in Revelation 14, as we're finally seeing God step in, because we will be patiently waiting, and it says, I'm just going to go back to Revelation 6 when we see the 5th seal being broken. It says, then he opened the 5th seal, and I saw under the altar the souls of those who had been slain for the word of God and for the testimony which they held. Now those are those who will be going through tribulation for 3.5 years. And they cried with a loud voice, saying, how long, O Lord, holy and true, until you judge and avenge our blood on those who dwell on the earth? And a white robe was given to each of them, and it was said to them that they should rest a little while longer until the number of their fellow servants and their brethren, who would be killed as they were, was completed. It's 3.5 years. And now what we're seeing is, after that is completed, the bowls of judgment, the justice that God is bringing, that the first angel proclaimed on the lawlessness of the earth, is now being rained down on the earth. Then let's go back to Revelation 14:8. And another angel followed, saying, Babylon is fallen, the great city, because she has made all nations drink of the wine of the wrath of her fornication. It's an incredible thing, the justice that God is going to bring to the earth, because his kingdom is coming on earth as it is in heaven, and it begins with justice. He is the God of justice. So I hope these videos are helping. Again, tomorrow we're going to hit the wine of the wrath of her fornication pretty heavy, because it is brutal. Love to hear your thoughts on it. Put in the comments below. If you like this video, click like and subscribe. If you feel called to support this channel through Patreon, that link is also below. But the most important part of this channel, we take prayer requests, so never hesitate to send that in. Thank you for watching this episode of God, Family, and Guns. And as always, love God, love your family, and love guns.